visit with us and spend a few days in helping us think about our faith. We are grateful, and I think one of the best things about Faith Forum for me as the university chaplain is I get the opportunity to drive around the speaker. So we have these great conversations in and out of cars going from point A to point B. So it's been wonderful. Thank you, David, for your graciousness in our conversations. It's been a good few days, and we're kind of ending our series today. David will be talking about the theme of vocation. But let me point your attention to just a couple of the books that are available at the university bookstore for a discount, so that we try to make it as inexpensive as possible for you to purchase them. UnChristian, What a New Generation Really Thinks About Christianity and Why It Matters. A market analysis on outsiders and their perceptions of Christianity. And this is the one that I have been really chewing on, so to speak, for the last months. You Lost Me, Why Young Christians Are Leaving the Church and Rethinking Faith. As you know, Eastern University is a Christian university, and although we have things like chapel and Wednesday night worship and Sunday night worship, we actually believe in the church. Yeah, there's no plan B. I don't think Jesus said, let's try it for a couple of thousand years. And if not, you can go to Starbucks on Sunday morning and kind of have a scone and scripture. I don't think that's the plan. So we have to address the reason why, and I think, David, just to thank you and the Barna Group for helping us think through what's going on and how can we, as an institution, address these issues. So I really appreciate this. And like I said, this is a great book for faculty, staff, anyone who's working here at the university would benefit greatly by that. After this Windows on the World, you're all invited to come and have lunch with us at 11:30 in the Baird Library, which is over in Walton Hall, number 2. If you're a visitor today, we will pay for your lunch. We just want to have a bit of an extended conversation. It will be informal. David may make a remark or two, but we'll talk about some of the themes that he is going to be talking about today. Frederick Buechner, the retired pastor, author, once said about vocation is, the place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. Would you please welcome David Kinnaman.
Well, good morning. Y'all sleep well? I'm on Western Pacific time still, so it still feels really early to me. I woke up at like 3:30 in the morning. It was like 12:30 when I'm usually watching television or hanging out with my kids or doing something with my wife. So anyway, you know, like I'm trying to get adjusted. See, I usually have to speak like on the East Coast early in the morning. For me, that's sort of like hell. But for me, my vision of heaven is having all you people and doing like a talk at midnight, you know, one day, you know. So just we can wait for that. When we're in heaven and I'm doing my PowerPoints, you can be like, all right, I'm signing up for your midnight show. All right, so we want to talk about vocational discipleship, and this idea of vocation is actually some themes that we're going to be working on in the next work that we're doing. So we plan to do more writing and research on this particular topic, the idea of vocation. And really when you talk about vocation, it's the idea of calling, it's the idea of, you know, career and some other things that might be connected in there. Let's talk about sort of the history of some of this. I mean, the ideas and theology of vocation go back quite a few years. And so when we talk about the Reformation and the Protestant Reformation, what are some things that happened during the Protestant Reformation? What are some concepts that came to the forefront during that revolutionary period of time? What are some terms, ideas that made the Reformation what it was?
Individual conscience.
Okay, individual conscience. What else?
Focus on Scripture.
Okay, in what way?
In that there was more authority given to Scripture than
Okay.
Sale of indulgences.
The sale of indulgences, good, right?
the printing press.
Printing press, right. We talked a little about that yesterday. What else? How about the priesthood of all believers, right? This is an interesting concept that was pretty radical at the time, that not just the clergy could read and interpret scriptures, and that there was a sense in which we were all called to understand, you know, God's leading in our lives. Here's another interesting one. How about the Protestant work ethic? Right? Like, there's a fascinating argument that's made in a book called Civilization that the Protestant work ethic actually was one of the, he calls it the killer apps, that changed the Western world. Because at the time of the Reformation, actually the East, Asian cultures were far superior to European cultures in their knowledge of science and their sort of literature and all, sort of just their sophistication of their cultures. Well, what happens, like how can we explain the fact that the West has become much more dominant in the last 500 years? And he talks about things like free market economies and science, and the work ethic is one of those, Protestant work ethic is one of those things that defined us, right? So when we talk about the Reformation Reloaded, I think one of the most important things that we learn in our research, and I'm going to show you some of the stats in just a minute, but one of the things that we learned in the You Lost Me research is that most of your peers, one of the reasons that so many of them are walking away from their faith, is that they don't have any idea like that God is calling them into some work. I remember sitting on a plane next to a young woman who's coming back from Africa, really bright college student, and she has a Catholic background, and we were talking about like her interest in trying to serve the poor in Africa, and like we had this probably 30-minute conversation about that. We had been doing some research for the One campaign at the time, so she was really interested in that, and for World Vision and Compassion and other groups. And I remember saying, well, it seems to me that what you're doing is a calling. And she was like, it was like literally I could see the light bulb go on above her head, like in the cartoons, and she had never really considered that her work and her interest in this was something of a calling. So I think there's a huge opportunity for us within the church to recast really a vision of vocation, that we're reconnecting faith and work. And it's imperative that we do this. I'm going to show you something of what's called an infograph that kind of describes how we're different today. And there's an interesting argument that some people make about the size and sort of influence of the church in the 1860s, around the time of the American Civil War, that basically the church, in terms of its land ownings, its influence in culture, in other ways, it was almost equal to everything else in culture. Like government wasn't so big as it is today, right? Education wasn't so big. In fact, most of education was what? Church-based, right? So the church was almost equal to the size of all the other structures in our culture. And what's happened isn't that the church has gotten so much smaller, it's that everything else has gotten so much more complex. Mass transit, consumer culture, nonprofits didn't even exist, really, right? Like, we're living in a period of time that is so crazy because it's complicated in this accelerated life that so many of us are living. And so it's not just about faith and work, like, go to work and have a little Bible devotional on, like a little daily calendar where you flip the thing and what's the Bible verse for the day, right? Like that's a very superficial understanding of integrating faith and work. That's not a theology of vocation. Really, it's connecting faith and work, and it's connecting our work to life's complexity, right? So issues of sex and sexuality, issues of mothering and fathering, issues of neighborliness, issues of justice are really part of this really thick view, really sort of holistic biblical understanding of vocation. We're called to all of these things. Now here's the problem. When we do our research with 16 to 29-year-olds in the book You Lost Me, this is mind-blowing, and it's just a tragedy, is that, look at the bottom number there, 16% of people who grew up, went to church as a teenager, 16% say they understand how the Bible applies to their career or field of interest, right? So the vast majority of young people who grew up in a church have no concept of how the simplest idea, like how the Bible applies to your work. Now, you all here, being at a Christian school, you've opted in some way. Something drew you here. You were called to come here. Maybe your parents came, or your brothers, or your whatever. You're here at a Christian school, so you had maybe more of a sensitivity to this. Maybe you didn't. Maybe Eastern is the place that's starting to cultivate this sense of calling in your life. I don't know. But when you think about it, it's amazing to me that so few of your peers as students are aware of this. Now, here's another fascinating thing from the research. We know that 52% of teenagers in churches are interested in some type of science-related career. This is medicine, this is engineering, this is veterinarian sort of stuff, mathematics, biology, the hard sciences, climatology, all the rest. But check out the fact that less than 1/2 of 1% of youth pastors have spoken on issues of science in the last year. Like there's this, we go dutifully to church, and do we hear anything about what we might be called to? Typically not. This is a huge, huge gap. Like, is Christ Lord of all, or does he matter in these areas? Is there a way in which we can imagine that our faith ought to matter? I'm going to show you, a friend of mine has a little 8-year-old son. His name is Keaton. He's already a master at PowerPoints. I've offered him a job. He's 8 right now, but I've in 20 years when he's ready, we're ready to hire him on, because he's a master of PowerPoints, and you got to be impressed by that really when it gets down to it. All right, apparently not, but okay. So here's his life goals. My 10 life goals is to grow up to be a nice Christian man, to get a nice wife, get a good job, one that I like, have 2 kids, each boy is 2 years apart. There's some family planning for you. Grow as close as I can to get to God. Make more and more friends as I grow. Work hard in school. Believe in God wherever I go. Teach my kids about God and help them live their lives as best as they can. Do not give up in life, right? Like, how cool is that? All right, now check it out. Possible jobs. Engineer, science-minded, architect, hockey player, Lego designer. Love it, right? And he's even picked the place, right? Like, it's not just a Lego designer anywhere. Actually, he lives in Minneapolis. So on days like today, you can imagine that this guy wants to move to California or Florida. I mean, really, who wouldn't? All right, so now this is great. So his wife, he's even got this mapped out. A Christian woman, humorous, hardworking, caring, energetic, strong when hurt, is a leader, likes to help others, doesn't care what others think. Warning, will not get all this out of a woman. I love it, man. The brutal realities of an 8-year-old life, right? He's already jaded. My friend who knows Mark and his wife, Mark Rano and his wife, said that if you actually know his wife, that she is all those things. So he's probably just hedging his bets in case he can't find someone as great as mom. But okay, so this is fascinating, right? An 8-year-old has a life plan. Like, my son wants to play for the Yankees. I don't know. You can boo if you want, right? Or cheer. But I mean, like, is he going to play for the Yankees? Probably not, right? Don't put this on YouTube, right? Or edit that part out. But he has in a sense of what he wants to do. My daughter Emily, she loves to write. She's interested in certain kinds of things. We know that, like, our world is oriented around great talent and what people are called to do. And even as an 8-year-old, he's already starting to think about this. Is he going to end up as a Lego architect? I don't know. But it's fascinating. And I wonder, here's what I wonder, is if the church, if the local congregations that he's attending and that millions of young Christians are attending have any capacity to help cultivate that. Your sense of what God's calling you to do, beyond just the simple platitudes, the simple, easy, God's going to make a difference in your life. Well, what if you experience massive disappointment in your life and grief? That's part of our vocation too. This last Sunday, our home church pastor, his daughter is 8 or 9 years old, and she has been diagnosed with cancer for the 4th time. And he gave a sermon about, we're getting a scan this week, and we're not, we know what's likely to happen, but we're trusting God that he can do a miracle. But we're also we want to be, stand firm with you guys and love Jesus despite this. We're not called to ask God why. We're just called to ask God, to be with us. And his whole, it's sad. It makes me emotional just thinking about Daisy, because all of us have been praying and donating and trying to help, and their vocation, right? It's called for the best parts of life. And your wedding day, and it's also your vocation, when you might have to bury one of your kids, right? Like that, those are the rough realities. And obviously the church is at its best. It does help us deal with those things. But at its best, like I'm just asking you, like, is it possible that we've missed some really deep understanding of vocation in the way we teach about it? That what we're called to do is really, really critical. How are the opportunities that you're sensing going to align with what God wants to do? This is a fascinating statistic, is that 54% of millennials either have started their own business or intend to. It's a very entrepreneurial generation. I think that's a huge opportunity for us. You know, you hear at Eastern, and there's a great heritage of justice. Here's what I want to ask you to consider. God's going to call you, and is already calling you, into one of the channels of influence. And it could be, you know, media, arts, entertainment, business, education, government, the social sector, church. Education is, you know, some of the science maybe, or you might be working for a for-profit business in the realm of science. This is from my colleague Gabe Lyons at qideas.org. Great place to check out tons of information about how to think Christianly about these different vocational areas. And so, you know, God's going to call you, and He's already preparing you. You're here. You selected a major, maybe you haven't, but you know, you already have some sensitivity to something, and God's calling you to be entrepreneurial, or to serve Him in that. And think about the great tradition of caring about issues of justice. You know, Shane Claiborne is a good friend, and you know, like that's awesome, right? We're maybe not going to all live our lives. Our calling is going to be quite the same way Shane's is. That's why God has the body of Christ, the diversity of the saints. And the issue is, like, how can you be justice-minded in the work God's calling you to do? How can you bring a sense of monasticism, of Sabbath, of rhythm, of spiritual discipline into the work God's calling you to? I can't answer that question, but like, how are you being prepared for that? How are you going to make that a reality? Here's a young woman. Do you know of this person, Katie Davis? She skipped college, fought it out with her father, and said, I have to do what God's calling me to do. Went to Uganda and adopted like 17 or 19 Ugandan girls. And she's a teacher there. I mean, that's her calling. She's running a small little business, and that she's, you know, she's an educator, she's a fundraiser, she's an author, she's a speaker, she's a mom. She's pursuing God's calling. I love this quote. This is from the founder of Square and Twitter, Jack Dorsey. He says, the most efficient means to spread an idea today is a corporate structure. That's a fascinating idea, that like, if we're going to be considered evangelists, if we're going to try to help people live better lives, maybe some of you are just called to build great businesses that you can employ people. And again, Jesus matters in that. He matters in the kinds of businesses that you run, the way you think about equitable pay and what happens. You know, we had one of the guys I hired recently, you know, his wife has diabetes while she's pregnant, and then, you know, like, I expected him to travel and do all sorts of things, but he's got to be home and give her insulin shots. And we're like, okay, Clint, we got to restructure, you know, like great, like, you take care of your wife. That's your primary responsibility. We'll orient our work so that you can do the stuff from home over the next 6 months. You know, I mean, like, is it hard for us as an employer, as a business, to have one of our vice presidents sort of homebound? Of course. But, you know, that's important. That's a way for us to be pursuing our vocational calling as an employer, as a person who's on mission with Christ. And so this idea of a corporate structure spreading an idea, it's really interesting to me, because, you know, you think about Apple, or you think about Twitter, or you think about the kinds of things that take place. I mean, even American Idol is really a corporate structure. It's a concept. McDonald's is a corporate structure. It's a concept about accessibility to food. And if you were here yesterday about chemical-laden hamburgers, that's a joke. That's just a joke. But I don't want to go all into it. But my oldest daughter believes that there's chemicals in McDonald's hamburgers, and so she's been telling my son about that. But so, like, there's this idea of corporate structure. Like, there's a sense in which, like, a corporate structure gives a certain sort of like our experience with music today as human beings is greatly influenced by iTunes and Apple. There's a sense that we have about the accessibility of music, and that relates to these corporate structures that have been built around us. Some of you are going to be called to building great corporate structures, to working within broken corporate structures into bringing a better sense of justice, a better sense of fairness, a better sense of the kingdom into those corporate structures. All right, well, let's turn to Scripture and talk a little bit about what this might mean for us in terms of Babylon. I used this idea yesterday that maybe we could understand living as faithful believers in a culture of complexity, because that's what Daniel did, right? That's what Esther did. That's what Jeremiah did. And they were able to navigate this. And again, it's really easy for us to sort of enshrine these people as heroes of the faith and make their lives really simple because it makes for a good Sunday school lesson. You know, maybe like this. Right? So there's Daniel, and he's hanging out with Mufasa and Simba, right? Who knew that The Lion King Part 1 was actually back at the, in the Babylonian exile? No, so I mean, like, this is what, when you think of Daniel, you think of the lion's den, right? And if you heard the talk on Wednesday, like, there is this courage that Daniel has to be proximate to a very foreign culture and to follow his calling as a prophet. And that was really difficult work. It's not a cartoon. And so, here's some different verses if you want to write these down and check them out. Learning the language and science of Babylon, learning the literature of Babylon. We hear all about that story in Daniel 1. Jeremiah, we see his vocational calling expressed this way: before you were born, I set you apart as my spokesperson. I mean, how cool is that? Esther 4:13, you know this verse probably, for such a time as this, for such a time as this, you've been a sex slave in the king's harem, and now you get to use that influence in a very particular way because God's calling you to save his people. And what does Mordecai say? If you don't do it, God will figure out a different way. How about that advice from your uncle, right? And then I love this one, Exodus 31:6. I've given special skill to all the naturally talented craftsmen who are building the tabernacle. So he's talking about people that are painters and craftsmen. I mean, that is cool, right? Like, God gives a special ability to these people. A friend of mine showed me this verse, actually. We have a small little contribution from him at the very back of the book, You Lost Me. And he's an architect. And he designed PNC Park, guys, like the ballpark where the Pirates play, Pittsburgh Pirates play. And he's a cool dude. And you can read the little section that he have about how when he read this verse, it gave him permission to be an architect in a way that he had never heard in a local congregation. Again, I'm not critiquing pastors. I'm not angry or cynical about that. As Chaplain Joe said, like this idea of being a part of the church, it's the one place where all the vocations come together. We can think about how to serve our communities as educators and architects and writers and carpenters, and every vocation, it comes together on Sunday morning to think about our calling. So we need the local church. But isn't it sad, isn't it tragic that a guy with as much architectural talent as my friend David would never hear about this, that he's called to be an architect. And he, fortunately, providentially, through a Holy Spirit moment, he reads this and he gets permission to be an architect, and a great one at that. By the way, did you know that he said that, what was the old stadium there? Three River Stadium, right? Is that right? And he said that the original plan for that, it's a really beautiful, the new one, PNC Park, is very beautiful with the skyline and all. The original plan for Three Rivers included a wedge to see the downtown skyline. But it got cut out at the last minute. Guess why? Because it was made in a big circle, right? Kind of like a alien spaceship that landed there. Guess why? Because they could sell more seats. And he said if they had built it with the aesthetics in mind, we wouldn't have had to build a brand new ballpark. We could have remodeled it. But because they were so greedy and just to build more seats, like that was the thing that, that drove them. So how cool is it that a Christian architect, or an architect who happens to be a very faithful Christ follower could come to PNC and build something that could last for a century? Now, you may have heard this. This is one of the classic verses about calling in all of Scripture. Jeremiah 29. And Jeremiah says this really fascinating thing. How many of you know what this is? I'm not going to. There's 3 slides here that I'll show you. How many of you know what this context is? Yeah.
From here to
Go, let's do here.
Sorry, this is the exilic period right now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Good. And do you know what advice he's going to give us?
Make yourself at home.
Make yourself at home. That's about it. Yeah, make yourself at home. Stretch your legs. But now check this out. This is pretty interesting because I want you just to notice very quickly because he talks about place in the first sentence here, all right? This is what the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of Israel, says to all the captives he has exiled to Babylon from Jerusalem. From a culture of simplicity, from a culture of homogeneity, from a culture where faith is first, to a culture where we don't have much control, to a culture of acceleration, to a culture of pagan spirituality, to a culture that is self-indulgent and hedonistic and narcissistic. And does that sound anything like our world today, right? Like that's what I'm arguing. We're experiencing something that is like this Babylonian exile. The church isn't in power anymore. And we have to get comfortable with that. And then he gives this advice. He says, build homes and plan to stay. Plant gardens and eat the food they produce, marry and have children, then find spouses for them so that they may have many grandchildren, multiply and do not dwindle away. And then he says this powerful thing, work, and in parentheses you can imagine, whatever it is, architecture, veterinarian, biology, climatology, environmental studies, whatever it is that God wants you to work for the peace and prosperity of the city where I sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, for its welfare will determine your welfare. Now, guys, I don't have time to go into it in one little session, but this whole section, if you read Jeremiah 24, there's a whole debate about the good figs and the bad figs. And Jeremiah 28 and later in Jeremiah 29, Jeremiah actually tells us about the people who don't agree with him. There's this guy Hananiah, who literally makes a mockery of Jeremiah. I mean, again, we sort of put this like Jeremiah, like he made it in the Bible. He's awesome, right? Like, well, not everyone thought that at the time. And so they make a mockery. Hananiah makes a mockery of Jeremiah. He breaks off this like yoke that he has because he's has like this oxen yoke on his shoulders to symbolize what's going to happen to the people of Israel in exile. And Hananiah's like, Jeremiah, you are crazy. Like, we're going to get out of here in a couple of years. Don't worry about this. And Jeremiah sort of says, well, all right, we'll see who's right. And a few months later, Hananiah is dead. And later in Jeremiah 29, another one of the critics come and Jeremiah tells us about him. And he says, well, the crazy prophet Jeremiah predicts we're going to be here for a long while. He even wants us to plant trees because he thinks we're going to think about this. We're considering we had one of our trees in our backyard, fall down, and we're trying to figure out what tree we want to plant, whether it's just going to be a leafy tree or maybe an avocado tree. And like, we have to think, will we be here long enough to eat avocados from this tree, or are we just doing this for the next, the next owner, right? The critic of Jeremiah literally says he wants us to stay because he thinks we're going to be here long enough to even benefit from the fruit trees that we plant. So like all of this skepticism comes to Jeremiah because they don't believe that the vocation of the people of God is to be in Babylon. I'm asking you to consider this, that our vocation as the people of God today is to be in a world that we cannot control. We cannot change American culture. It doesn't matter who you elect as president or who you don't elect as president. It doesn't matter, like, what movie gets made. I mean, in the broad scheme of this stuff, like, our world is super complicated. There is no way any one of us can, make a difference in that whole thing. God has called you to a particular place at a particular time to make an impact, to plant a tree, to build a good business. Some people ask me about my aspirations for Barna Group. I mean, it's really humbling, but, like 91% of pastors in America know of Barna Group. And so this is a huge company, a very prominent brand. And often what I'll say is, as the Lord leads, I hope to build a sustainable business. Let the Lord do what he will with our influence. Like, that's not in my control. And so I love that the way that Jeremiah is asking us to seek the peace and prosperity of the city where he sent us into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, for its welfare will determine your welfare. Whatever God's going to ask you to do in terms of justice, in terms of being thinking Christians, being caring, listening, human beings, you're gonna have to make friends across a lot of differences. You're going to have to learn from people with whom maybe your parents are just absolutely offended that you'd even be friends with that person, right? All right, let's talk about one other aspect of this. Sex. Sex is vocation. Our sexual lives are something of a vocational decision, right? We had a great interview with some of your fellow classmates, she and Asia there, and I don't know if we... Leah, and is Leah here? And Alicia. I don't see them here. They had so much fun last night, they're just sleeping in, I'm sure. We had a good conversation, and they talked about the theology of the body, right? And the idea that, this deep, thick, rich idea of what God calls us to do. And I want to suggest that what's happening in our culture is that we have a generation of torn souls, all right? So we have, on one hand, this traditionalist narrative about sex. So sex is about the rules. You don't talk about sexuality. The ultimate end is exclusively about sort of like procreation. And so in a lot of churches, in a lot of traditions, we're painting with, I'm generally talking about the way this is. This is not true in a lot of places, but in general, this is something of like the old school traditionalist idea about sexuality. This is, like if you ever saw I Love Lucy, this is where like Lucy and her husband, what is his name? Ricky, yeah, of course. Desi, I was thinking of his actor name, of his real name. Like they sleep in separate beds, right? Like where did even little Ricky come from, right? We don't even care. Like we don't know. We don't want to talk about it. That's like off screen. No one even imagines that. They don't want to even think about it. One time my dad's a pastor, and I can't remember exactly how this came up, but he was talking with someone in his congregation, and she basically said, it's really better if a pastor adopts his children, because then, that he's not having sex as often with his wife. That's a traditionalist idea, right? Like I'm grateful that my dad had sex with my mom, right? Now, when you talk about the reason why we're torn is because so many of us were so influenced by what I would describe as an individualist narrative. And sex is about me. It's about our own personal journey and our expression of enjoyment and self-satisfaction. And the end really is like our own gratification and, kind of like my own journey. And even though you have lots of partners or would-be partners or, digital partners, like it's all about whatever, right? Like it's about us. It's my own sexual journey. And frankly, I think a lot of churches have actually like tried to become more in tune with culture, and they'll talk about sexuality like if you just wait till you get married, you're going to have mind-blowing sex, and like it's all going to work out great for you. And like that's really kind of more of an individualist narrative, isn't it? It's like you're waiting and being pure, not because it's your vocational calling to be pure and save yourself and what God may be asking you to do, to give yourself in marriage, but it's because it's about what, like how great it's going to be for you. And, so like we've sometimes like mirrored culture rather than trying to like speak prophetically to it about this issue of sexuality. So we're torn. Like this is like if you think about how entertainment has changed over the last 50 years. Like I remember watching some of the episodes of Seinfeld when it first came out. I know that that's a previous thing. You may not have even seen any of them, but like I was offended at times about the way they would talk about sex and sexuality, and now I'll watch the reruns and it doesn't even like faze me as much as it did. And like we're all being like diluted by all this incredible amount of information and sexual stimulation and sexual storylines. And is it part of life? Absolutely. Do you think that MTV or movies can accurately describe like a biblical sexual ethic in 90 minutes? In 30 minutes on, you know, a show like 16 and Pregnant? The sex lives of American teenagers? Or secret lives of American teenagers, right?
Same thing.
Apparently, same thing. Apparently I haven't watched that show. I mean, they're telling just enough truth to be dangerous, right? But they're changing our vocational sensibility. Like the church has a vocation to talk about sex and sexuality in a way that is true to human flourishing. And we've lost that creative mantle. We've lost the ability to see that actually making a great film about this that tells the truth is part of our calling. So where could we end on this? I mean, to me, maybe a relational ethic is where we see the ties being brought back together, that sex is about us, that there's a sense of interdependence and consciousness of others, that all the sexual choices, the sum total of the things we choose to do with our bodies actually do affect, like think about this, like your choices as sexual beings in this weekend are going to affect your future spouse and your future kids and your grandkids. That's a huge burden that we have. I mean, friends, when I'm on the road and traveling, like, listen, I work really hard. I'm very protective of my time and my attentions. But I'm a guy. I get tempted. What if I chose to make unwise choices? Do you think the consequences for me and my family and the Barna Group and the reputation, do you think that the media might be interested in telling about an affair that I might have as an author? I mean, I got an email last night from someone who writes for a major magazine, and she was full of skepticism about that younger Catholics could actually believe the teachings of the Catholic Church about sexuality. She can't believe it. Well, she's just looking for someone to make a mistake. She's looking to prove her point, friends. And like, this is a huge, huge question. We have a vocational calling with our sexual identities, with our sexuality. And it's not as simple as what maybe the sermon you heard in youth group about just staying pure. All right, here's where I'm going to end. The Christian community needs exiles. Like Daniel and his friends weren't just sort of like on the sidelines, like there's 2 movies playing, and like that's just a small little thing that's happening. Like that's a huge part of what God is asking us to do, is to recognize our role as citizens of a nation, a world, a digital culture that's more and more like Babylon. It's not really a place. It's not like America is Babylon. It's sort of like this whole stew that we're living in of everything. And maybe some of us are called to be exiles, to navigate faithfulness in this changing culture. And maybe some of you are going to be working in movies and film and journalism and justice issues and environmental issues. And you're going to feel like an exile. You're going to feel like the Christian community is pushing you away because they don't get it. And you're going to feel like you don't fit in either place. You don't fit in the world because you don't have the same morality and values of the world. And you don't fit sometimes in the church because they don't seem to get what you're concerned about, what God has put on your heart to be a vocational call. And I guess my challenge to you is don't give up on the church. Don't sacrifice like your credibility with the world. Don't seek that first. Like God's the person who gives that to you. He's the one who makes it happen. You know, whether you get a big break in your business or a big break with the things that you've been working on your whole life. But don't give up on the people of God. Like we're broken. We're imperfect. You heard this on Wednesday. You know, you at your worst are no better than your criticism of the church. And we have this huge opportunity as people of God to live out this vocational identity. Okay, if you're interested in connecting or pushing back, you can tweet me. You can also sign up for our free email newsletter. If you happen to be interested in data about Philly or any particular like region, state, you can get a ton of that at cities.barna.org. So again, we're just here to serve the Christian community, to serve you in your call, and to serve leaders. If you're a faculty member or a local pastor, it's a privilege to be able to do this at Barna. And so we've got lots of free and pay-for resources that are available at those places. So anyway, thank you so much. Let's take a couple questions. Joe, do you want to help moderate that?
Sure. We'll get you to take some students if that's...
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
so
we'll
take a couple...
6 or 7 minutes. Maybe a student or two would like to have a question for David. That would be wonderful.
We're going to start with a student, if you don't mind, if there's any student questions. Any students? I know you're already thinking about the weekend. Yeah, go ahead.
You're talking a lot about the millennial group, how it's kind of post-teenage years, 18 plus. I'm going into youth ministry. How, in kind of simple words, how can I affect them going, or youth ministries in general, and just that age group? How can we affect them going into that stage?
Yeah. Well, youth ministry is so critical because it's the linchpin of like their last experience often with a local church. And so I think vocational discipleship is so important. So everything you can do to expose them to different careers, different Christians who are in different vocations. So I mean, we laugh about bring your dad to work day, right? But like you should have those times when you bring in, like we're going to have a lawyer in, and he's going to talk about his faith and what he does. There's a really cool book, and it's way buried in the end of this. So I'm not recommending this book for the purpose of vocational discipleship. It's called Unbroken. It's about a World War II pilot. It's a great book about like he was a captive in Japan and all the rest. But he's a Christian. He was actually an Olympian, and he ended up doing, when he came back to the States, he would do these Christian camps, and he said he would show films of people doing different vocations because he wanted them to see, like, look, you could do this. Look, you could do this. Look, you could do this. I mean, just think about your typical experience at a camp. And because we're so interested in, like, the Jesus moment, and I'm all about the decision to follow Jesus, but, like, for a lot of us, we made that decision, like, 17 times in 1 year alone in youth ministry, right? Like, it's not, like, what is next? And what's next is follow Jesus and be a great researcher. And so like I had to wait till college to begin to read and think about issues of vocation, as many of you probably have. So I would say like bring vocational issues into your youth ministry early. Another student question. All right, let's go over here.
It is a student question, actually.
That's great.
My question is, what would you say to a student at this time of life who is in a great deal of anxiety over what exact work God may be calling them to?
Really good question. Well, one of the major trends that you probably are aware of is that it's harder than ever to get a job straight out of college, right? That's not good news. But, I mean, first of all, we have seen in our business interns just, you know, they come in and volunteer, or it's very small pay kind of stuff. So find an organization that you really are passionate about and just make it your effort to try to, you know, work with them, serve them, do whatever it is. Like we're launching a couple of big research projects that we would love to have some help on, but, you know, like we're often short-handed for that. So I think working as interns is really critical. Try to find a mentor if you can. You know, so you can get jobs. There are jobs that are out there available, but if you have two jobs that you're trying to choose from, or you find somebody that you really like the way they handle themselves as a believer, as a leader, it doesn't even have to be a Christian necessarily, but like you really want to try to like emulate that person. It's much better if it was a Christian mentor, to be honest. And the exception might be like, you know, you want to be a movie maker, right? And you get to intern with somebody who's a great producer or director, you know, like go for it, you know, and then have other Christian mentors in your life as well. But finding a mentor, working an intern, you know, we talked a little bit about this yesterday, but a lot of you all feel like you're going to be famous or well known. So like, you know, try to be as unnarcissistic as possible in coming into the work that you're doing, and just learn, read tons, Yeah, so those are a couple
I
ideas.
just want to follow up that the anxiety I see constantly is concern that God may not be approving of what I'm planning. In other words, does God choose this? Do I choose this? How do I decide specifically what God wanted me to do?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. Obviously, there's a lot of different theological points of view on that. I think that there's a really good book by a friend, Kevin DeYoung. It says, Just Do Something. And he talks a little bit about the decision-making in the will of God. It's a really short book written for students, Just Do Something. And I mean, a lot of times I think God, you started out with that great quote of like, the thing that really gives you happiness, and that again, that could be a false idol, like I'm happy here so I want to do it. But something that really drives you, that you're passionate about, like God puts those passions there for a reason. And then sometimes he'll come to you and say like, okay, I want you to give that up. Maybe like the story of Abraham and Isaac, right? Where it feels like you really are pursuing it so hard that maybe your passion has become an idol. But I would just like give you a lot of confidence. Don't be anxious about that. God cares about you. He's going to direct your steps. There's a lot of sovereignty that I think comes into that. All right, one more question. Yes?
I feel, especially for people at Easter, I feel like, I think the vast majority, like 99% of people will feel like that their vocation needs to be in ministry, which isn't always necessarily the case. But I was wondering if you could just comment a little bit about how to be more, like have that proximity with culture and still, even in our vocations, which may or may not be in ministry, and talking about how we can and connect people to the church without necessarily being in the church.
Mm-hmm. Ask me that again. Like I'm not clear what you're asking. I want to make sure I really answer it.
Okay, so if we're not necessarily in other words, do we have to be part of? We don't have to be part of a ministry to bring people to introduce people to Christ. So how can we better do that in whatever context our vocation is?
Okay, good. So, well, for those of you that are called to ministry, you want to do youth ministry, or you want to do pastoral ministry, or you want to work at a Christian college or whatever, like first is to understand that part of your role ought to be to awaken the vocational callings of the rest of the church, right? So your vocation is in the church as a Levite, as a priest, as a worship leader, or whatever. Great. Well, that was one tribe. There were 11 other tribes in the nation of Israel. Not all of them were Levites. And so I don't know the exact percentage, but it's like 98% of Christians aren't professional Christians, and we got to give them the tools to live that out. And so the tools that they need to have the right books. They need to have their leaders talking about those things. We need to ordain them for ministry as public school teachers, right? Like maybe they don't get a certificate from our denomination, but they should be ordained publicly on the stage. Tell us about what you're doing in the public school. Tell us what you're doing in the environment. Tell us what you're doing as a scientist. Public recognition is so huge for anyone, and it ought to be for people in these different vocational callings as well. All right, I'm 1 minute over. Thank you for having me, and just enjoy your weekend and your day. Thank you very much.